The storm raged over the small town of Ashwood, drenching its cracked roads and sagging rooftops with relentless sheets of rain. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the twisted branches of the gnarled oak trees surrounding the old Maplewood cemetery. There, beneath the earth, something unnatural was stirring. A deep rumble echoed beneath the graves, unnoticed by the living. Then, the first skeletal hand broke through the mud. Another followed. The storm masked the sound of shifting soil and snapping wood as decayed bodies pulled themselves free from their coffins. Empty eye sockets and rotting flesh glistened under the rain. The dead had awakened. Miles away, in the heart of town, Daniel Carter leaned against the counter of the Red Lantern Diner, staring out at the storm through the fogged-up window. It had been a quiet night, too quiet. The few remaining patrons sipped their coffee and picked at their late-night meals, oblivious to the horrors about to descend upon them. "Storm's bad tonight," muttered Roy, the grizzled trucker seated at the bar, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. "Yeah," Daniel replied absently. "Feels wrong." His younger sister, Emily, popped up from behind the counter, rolling her eyes. "You always say that when there's a storm," she teased, brushing her blonde hair back. Daniel sighed. Maybe he was being paranoid. But something gnawed at him, an uneasy feeling that wouldn't fade. Across town, at the Ashwood General Hospital, a nurse named Rachel Evans was finishing up her night shift when the first body arrived. A man, covered in mud and blood, stumbled through the emergency room doors. His eyes were wide, his breathing ragged. I saw them," he gasped, clutching at Rachel's uniform with trembling hands. "They're coming. They're coming." Rachel exchanged a glance with Dr. Patel, who approached with concern. "Sir, please calm down." "Who's coming?" "The dead," the man wheezed. Then, before another word could escape, he convulsed violently. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. The heart monitor flatlined. Dr. Patel moved quickly, attempting resuscitation, but it was no use. Rachel felt a chill crawl down her spine as the man's body went still. Then his fingers twitched. Rachel gasped as the man's lifeless eyes suddenly opened, now clouded over with a sickly gray film. Before she could react, he lunged forward, sinking his teeth into Dr. Patel's neck. Blood sprayed across the sterile white walls. Screams erupted from the hospital halls as more bodies arrived, staggering, groaning, their mouths dripping with gore. Back at the diner, the door swung open with a loud bang. A man stumbled in, drenched from the rain. His shirt was torn, and his face was pale as death. The patrons turned to stare as he wobbled forward, his lips moving silently. Roy stood up. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" The man's head jerked toward Roy, his eyes blank and soulless. Then, with a guttural growl, he lunged. The trucker barely had time to react before the man's teeth sank into his forearm. Roy roared in pain, shoving the attacker back. "What the hell?" Daniel yelled, grabbing a metal tray from the counter. Emily screamed as the man turned on her next, blood dribbling from his mouth. His movements were erratic, twitchy, like a puppet whose strings had been severed. Without thinking, Daniel swung the tray, smashing it into the man's head. The impact sent him sprawling, but he didn't stay down. Within seconds, he was clawing his way back up, undeterred by the blow. Roy clutched his bleeding arm, panting heavily. What the hell is wrong with this guy? Then the screaming began outside. Daniel rushed to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw figures staggering through the streets. Some crawled on all fours, others sprinted unnaturally fast. Blood splattered the sidewalks. Bodies lay strewn across the pavement, twitching, then rising again. Emily backed away, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel, what's happening?" Daniel swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't know. But whatever it was, it was just beginning. The Red Lantern Diner was no longer a place of late-night comfort and greasy food. It had become a battleground. Roy clutched his bleeding arm, his breathing ragged. The wound was deep, too deep. He slumped against the counter, sweat beading on his forehead. Daniel tightened his grip on the metal tray, heart pounding as the thing that had attacked them staggered back to its feet. Blood still dripped from its mouth. Its head lolled to one side at an unnatural angle, but it showed no sign of pain, no hesitation. Emily was frozen in place, hands over her mouth. "Daniel, we have to go." The creature lunged again. Daniel reacted instantly, swinging the tray like a baseball bat. This time, he didn't stop swinging. He smashed it over and over, until the thing's skull finally cracked, and it collapsed to the floor in a twitching heap. Silence followed, except for the heavy breathing of the remaining diner patrons. What in God's name was that? Roy groaned, gripping the counter for support. His arm was turning a sickly shade of gray. Before Daniel could answer, another sound broke through the quiet. Screams. Daniel rushed to the window and saw hell unfolding outside. The street was chaos, people running in all directions, some already overtaken by the horde of shambling figures. One woman tripped, and within moments, they were on her, tearing into her flesh. A man was desperately banging on a locked car door, but before he could get inside, a pair of hands grabbed him from behind. His screams were short-lived. Daniel's stomach twisted. "They're everywhere," he muttered. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "We have to go. Right now." The remaining patrons were already panicking. A young man in a leather jacket bolted for the door, ignoring Daniel's warning shouts. He didn't make it far. One of the creatures tackled him before he even reached the street. His agonized screams echoed through the night. Daniel cursed. "Barricade the door. Now." He and Emily shoved tables and chairs against the entrance, but it wouldn't hold for long. The creatures outside were relentless, pounding against the glass with bloodied hands. Their eyes, milky white, devoid of life, showed no fear, no hesitation. Roy coughed, his face pale and drenched in sweat. I don't feel so good." Daniel turned to check on him. The wound on Roy's arm was worse now. Dark veins crept up his skin like something was spreading beneath the surface. Daniel exchanged a horrified glance with Emily. Roy noticed. His breathing hitched. No, I ain't turning into one of them. I won't." The glass door cracked. They didn't have time to debate. "We need a way out," Daniel said. He turned to the other survivors. "The back door, does it lead to an alley?" One of the remaining patrons, a terrified teenage girl, nodded rapidly. Daniel made a decision. "We move, now." Emily hesitated. "What about Roy?" Roy gave a weak chuckle. "I ain't slowing you kids down." He pulled out his hunting knife and took a shuddering breath. "I'll buy you time." Daniel started to argue, but Roy's expression was set. There was no changing his mind. The glass shattered. The dead poured in. Daniel grabbed Emily's wrist and ran. The others followed, sprinting through the kitchen toward the back exit. Behind them, Roy let out a furious roar, swinging his knife at the first corpse to reach him. Daniel didn't look back. He kicked open the back door, emerging into the rain-soaked alley. The storm had lessened, but the town was still in chaos. Gunshots rang out in the distance. Sirens blared. The undead were everywhere. Emily was shaking. "Where do we go?" Daniel clenched his jaw. They had no car, no weapons, and no idea how far this outbreak had spread. One thing was clear. Nowhere was safe. Daniel barely had time to catch his breath before more figures emerged from the alley's shadows. The undead were spreading like wildfire, filling every street, every corner. "We can't stay here," he muttered. Emily clutched his arm, her fingers ice-cold. "Daniel, we don't even know where to go." A scream rang out from the rooftops. Daniel looked up just in time to see a man scrambling across the edge of an old apartment building. His clothes were tattered, and his face was smeared with blood. Below him, the street was a feeding ground, dozens of corpses hunched over fresh kills, tearing flesh with inhuman hunger. The man tried to leap to the next rooftop. He didn't make it. He plummeted into the swarm below. The dead were on him instantly. His cries were short-lived, swallowed by the sound of tearing flesh. Emily whimpered. "Oh, God." Daniel grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the end of the alley, where a rusted fire escape clung to the side of an old motel. He motioned to the others. Only two remained, the teenage girl from the diner and an older man in a security uniform, his name tag reading Harris. "Up the fire escape," Daniel ordered. The girl hesitated, eyes wide with fear. "What if we get trapped?" "Then at least we won't be eaten alive," Daniel shot back. Harris didn't argue. He helped boost Emily up, then scrambled after her. Daniel followed last, gripping the rain-slicked metal and pulling himself onto the first landing. Below them, the dead had noticed. Their moans grew louder, guttural and hungry. Pale hands reached for the ladder, fingers clawing at the air. The first few tried to climb, but their decayed limbs were useless, their coordination ruined. For now, they were safe. Daniel helped the others onto the roof. The motel's rooftop was flat, offering a view of the nightmare unfolding below. Fires burned in the distance, car alarms blared, and the streets were crawling with the dead. Harris cursed under his breath. "It's the whole damn town." Emily hugged herself, shaking. How did this happen? No one had an answer. Daniel scanned the rooftops. If they could keep moving across the buildings, they might find somewhere secure, somewhere with survivors. Then he spotted it. A large supermarket a few blocks away, its rooftop clear of any undead. A place like that might still have food, supplies, maybe even people. He pointed. "That's where we go." Harris frowned. "And how do you plan on getting across 3 blocks of zombie-infested streets?" Daniel looked at the connected rooftops between them. "We run. We jump." The teenager swallowed hard. "What if we fall?" Daniel didn't have a good answer for that. A sudden crash from below cut the conversation short. The fire escape ladder groaned. One of the creatures, a freshly turned corpse, had managed to climb up partway, using the railing for support. Its broken leg dangled uselessly, but its hands were strong enough to grip the metal rungs. Its jaw snapped open and closed, a grotesque display of hunger. Emily screamed. Harris reacted fast. He grabbed a discarded cinder block from the rooftop and hurled it over the edge. It smashed into the zombie's skull, sending it plummeting down. The body hit the pavement with a sickening crunch. The other undead let out an eerie, collective moan, surging toward the alley. Daniel's stomach dropped. They knew they were up here now. "We have to move," he said. No more hesitation. One by one, they sprinted across the first rooftop. The gap to the next building was small, but Daniel's heart pounded as he leaped over it. His feet barely hit the gravel before he turned to help Emily. Harris followed, landing hard but rolling to his feet. The teenage girl hesitated. I can't do it." Daniel reached out. "You can. Just jump." Tears streamed down her face. Below, the dead had flooded the alley, piling onto each other like ants. Then, a shriek. A door on the motel rooftop burst open. From inside, 3 more zombies stumbled out. Their clothes were torn, their faces twisted with hunger. They had been trapped inside, until now. The girl had no choice. She jumped. She didn't make it. Her hands barely caught the rooftop's edge. She dangled, legs kicking wildly. Daniel lunged, grabbing her wrists. Hold on. But the dead were already on her. The motel zombies grabbed her legs, their fingers digging into her flesh. She screamed, a piercing, bone-chilling sound. Emily sobbed. Pull her up. Daniel tried. But the creatures were too strong. With a sickening yank, the girl was ripped from Daniel's grasp. She fell backward into their waiting arms. The last thing they heard was her screams. Then, silence. Daniel stood frozen, staring down at his empty hands. Harris put a hand on his shoulder. She was gone the moment she didn't jump. Emily was crying. But there was no time to grieve. More undead were coming. Daniel clenched his jaw. We keep moving. The night was far from over. The girl's scream still echoed in Emily's ears as they ran. She wanted to look back, to see if there was anything left of her, but she already knew the truth. There was nothing left. Daniel didn't stop. He led them across another rooftop, moving faster than before. Every second spent standing still meant death. Harris wheezed, struggling to keep up. We're not gonna make it like this, he grunted. We need weapons. Shelter. Daniel didn't argue. They needed more than just a destination, they needed a way to fight back. The supermarket rooftop loomed ahead, but there was still one more rooftop to clear. This one had a wide gap. Too wide for Emily to jump. Daniel stopped at the edge, scanning the area. A rusty old plank lay nearby, part of a broken billboard. It was long enough to form a bridge. We use this, Daniel said, dragging it toward the gap. Harris helped him set it down. The metal groaned under its own weight, barely stable. Emily paled. That doesn't look safe. Neither does getting eaten, Harris said, stepping onto the plank first. He moved carefully, spreading his weight evenly. It held. Daniel gestured for Emily to follow. She hesitated, then forced herself to move. Step by step, she crossed, her breath coming in shaky gasps. Halfway across, the plank shifted. Emily froze. Daniel. I've got you, he said, keeping a hand on the plank. Just go. She hurried the rest of the way, nearly tripping as she stepped onto the next rooftop. Then it was Daniel's turn. He moved quickly, too quickly. The plank snapped. Daniel lunged, barely managing to grab the rooftop's edge. His legs dangled over the alley, where the dead were still gathered below. Emily screamed. Daniel. Harris grabbed his wrist, straining as he pulled him up. Daniel scrambled onto solid ground, chest heaving. That was too close, Emily whispered. Daniel sat up, wiping sweat from his brow. Yeah. Then he looked ahead, and his stomach dropped. The supermarket's roof access door was open. And they were not alone. A man stood in the doorway, holding a shotgun. His clothes were stained with blood, his eyes sunken from exhaustion. He aimed the gun at them, his finger tight on the trigger. Who the hell are you? He demanded. Daniel raised his hands. We're just trying to survive. The man's gaze flicked to Harris, then Emily. He seemed to be calculating. Then, finally, he lowered the gun. Get inside, he said. Before they see you. Daniel hesitated, but Emily was already moving. They had no choice, nowhere else to go. Inside, the supermarket was dimly lit, shelves pushed against the doors and windows to keep the undead out. A small group of survivors, 5 in total, huddled near the registers. The man with the shotgun locked the door behind them. Name's Carter, he said. And if you're staying here, you better pull your weight. Daniel met his gaze. Trust me, he said. We plan on surviving. But deep down, he knew survival always came with a cost. And soon, they'd all find out what that cost really was. The air inside the supermarket was thick with tension. The 5 survivors already inside did not look thrilled about new arrivals. Carter gestured for Daniel and the others to follow him deeper into the store. We don't have much, he said. Food's rationed. Water's running low. And if you think about stealing, just know, I don't miss. His fingers drummed against the shotgun stock as he spoke. Daniel wasn't intimidated. He understood men like Carter, men who thought being armed made them the leader. But Daniel wasn't here to challenge anyone. He just wanted to stay alive. The others in the group were a mix of exhausted and wary. A wiry man with a thick beard was counting cans of food, a woman in her 40s was bandaging a younger guy's leg, and 2 teenage boys whispered in the corner, casting nervous glances at Daniel's group. Emily stepped closer to Daniel. I don't like this place. Harris grunted. Better than the streets. Daniel agreed. For now. Carter clapped his hands together. All right. Since you're here, let's talk rules. Before he could, a scream cut through the air. Daniel turned toward the sound. It came from the storage area in the back. The woman tending to the wounded guy shot Carter a desperate look. It's Jenna, she whispered. She. Carter spun on his heel, shotgun raised. Stay here, he barked. Daniel didn't listen. He followed, Emily and Harris close behind. The storage room door was partially open. A young woman lay on the floor, convulsing. Her skin was pale, veins darkening. Daniel's stomach turned. She'd been bitten. Carter's expression hardened. He raised the shotgun. The woman tending to her, Jenna's mother, threw herself in front of the gun. No, she sobbed. There's still time. She's fighting it. Carter cocked the shotgun. You know that's not true. The others had gathered now, forming a silent circle. Jenna let out a choked gasp, her body trembling. Then, she stopped moving. Silence. Carter sighed. Lowered his weapon. It's done. Jenna's eyes shot open. She moved fast. Faster than Daniel thought possible. She grabbed her mother and bit into her throat. The woman's scream was brief. Blood sprayed across the walls. Panic erupted. Harris grabbed Emily and shoved her back. Move. Carter fired, boom. Jenna's head snapped back. She collapsed, but the damage was already done. Her mother, now dying, now turning, twitched violently on the floor. Daniel knew what came next. He grabbed Emily's hand and ran. The others followed, but fear had already destroyed whatever order they had. Survival meant trust. And after this? There wouldn't be any left. The gunshot had drawn attention. The supermarket's boarded-up windows rattled as dozens of undead clawed at the doors, drawn by the noise. Carter cursed, reloading his shotgun. Damn it! We need to reinforce the... Crash. The front window buckled. The creatures outside pushed harder, snarling, growling. Daniel spun toward Carter. We need a way out, now. Carter wasn't listening. He was too focused on what had just happened. He turned his gun on the survivors. This is what happens when you let your emotions get in the way, he spat. His gaze locked on the younger of the 2 teenage boys. Didn't I say we needed to put Jenna down earlier? The boy's lip trembled. We thought she'd be okay. Carter grabbed him by the collar. You thought? Thinking gets people killed. Daniel stepped between them, shoving Carter's arm away. Now's not the time for this. Carter glared. Stay out of this. Behind them, the barricade gave way. A rotting arm punched through the wooden boards. Then another. Daniel didn't wait. He grabbed Emily and Harris, making for the emergency exit. Come on. Carter saw him moving. Where the hell do you think you're going? Daniel didn't stop. Getting out before you get us all killed. A few of the others followed, panic driving them. The bearded man and the wounded teenager hobbled behind. Carter didn't chase after them. He just laughed. You think you'll make it out there? He called after them. There's nowhere left to run. Daniel didn't look back. They burst through the emergency exit and into the darkened alley. The undead were already spilling into the store. Carter and whoever stayed behind? They were on their own. Daniel didn't care. Where do we go? Emily panted, looking around wildly. Daniel didn't know. But they had to keep moving. Because now? They were alone. And the dead were still hungry. Daniel led the group deeper into the alley, his mind racing. The supermarket was lost, and now they had no food, no shelter, and nowhere to run. But they weren't alone. Not yet. Emily was right behind him, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. Harris moved slower, his old injuries slowing him down, and the two remaining survivors, the bearded man and the wounded teenager, struggled to keep up. Behind them, the supermarket was a feeding ground. Through the emergency exit, Daniel could hear the screams of those who had stayed behind, Carter's voice roaring in defiance before being silenced. It didn't matter now. All that mattered was surviving the night. Emily stumbled over a pile of garbage, barely catching herself. Daniel, where do we go? He scanned the alley. There were two ways forward. To the left, a narrow street leading deeper into the city, toward more buildings, more dark corners, more danger. To the right, a fenced-off construction site. Unfinished buildings. Scaffolding. Both options were bad. Daniel made a choice. We take the construction site, he said. We can hide in one of the unfinished buildings. Harris hesitated. And if they follow us? Daniel didn't answer. He climbed over the fence first, wincing as the metal groaned under his weight. Emily went next, then Harris. The bearded man helped the wounded teen up before climbing over himself. The site was a maze of half-finished structures and abandoned equipment. Steel beams stuck out of the ground like broken bones. A crane loomed overhead, swaying slightly in the wind. Daniel motioned for them to keep low. Stay quiet. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a sound. A single moan, deep and guttural. Emily's fingers dug into Daniel's sleeve. They're here. Daniel turned. The dead had found them. They came slowly at first, a few stragglers stumbling through the fence. Then, more. Crawling over the wreckage. Emerging from the darkness. Dozens of them. Daniel's heart pounded. They were trapped. The bearded man grabbed Daniel's shoulder. We need to split up. Daniel's mind raced. No, we stay together. But it was too late. The bearded man shoved the wounded teenager toward Harris. Take him. I'll lead them away. Before Daniel could stop him, he ran. Straight into the horde. Yelling. Waving his arms. Drawing them away. It worked, for a second. The undead turned toward him, their hunger overriding everything else. The bearded man reached the scaffolding, climbing up to the second level, too slow. They dragged him down. Daniel didn't watch. He grabbed Emily and Harris, hauling them toward the nearest unfinished building. The teenager whimpered in pain. I can't run anymore. Harris gritted his teeth. You don't have a choice, kid. They reached the stairwell of the half-built structure. It was dark, cold, the smell of damp concrete filling the air. Daniel pushed them forward. Higher. We go higher. They climbed. Behind them, the dead followed. Their growls echoed in the stairwell. Closer. Closer. Daniel reached the top floor. And froze. There was no exit. Just an open ledge. No walls. Just a straight drop to the pavement below. They were trapped. Emily gasped, backing away. Daniel, what do we do? Daniel's mind raced. The dead were coming. And soon? They would have nowhere left to run. The dead were closing in. Daniel could hear them climbing, stumbling, dragging themselves up the stairs. Their moans bounced off the unfinished concrete walls, a chorus of death. Emily clutched Daniel's arm. Harris held on to the wounded teenager, who was barely conscious. And in front of them? Nothing. Just a skeletal framework of steel beams and an open drop, 6 stories down. Daniel's mind raced. There had to be a way out. The undead reached the final landing. Daniel could see them now, half-rotten things with hollow eyes and gnashing teeth. Crawling. Clawing. Relentless. They had seconds. Then, an idea. Daniel grabbed a length of hanging construction cable from a nearby support beam. It was thick enough to hold weight, maybe. He turned to Harris. We can climb down. Harris looked at the cable, then at the drop. He muttered a curse. That's a damn long way. Better than staying. Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed the cable, wrapping it around her hands. I'll go first. Daniel nodded. Go. I'll hold them off. Emily slid over the edge, gripping tight. The cable groaned under her weight, but it held. The teenager was next. He was weak, barely able to hold on, but Harris helped guide him down. Then Harris turned to Daniel. Your turn. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. The first of the undead lunged. Daniel swung a steel pipe, smashing its skull in. The body crumpled, but more kept coming. Too many. Harris grabbed his collar. No heroics, damn it. Move. Daniel gritted his teeth, then sprinted for the cable. The dead surged forward. Daniel jumped, grabbing the cable and sliding down. His hands burned from the friction, but he ignored the pain. The wind rushed past his ears. Above them, the dead poured onto the ledge, reaching, snarling. Crack. The weight was too much. The concrete pillar snapped, sending the entire upper level crumbling. The dead fell. They tumbled from the 6th story, hitting the pavement in a sickening pile of broken limbs and crushed skulls. Daniel landed hard, rolling onto the ground. Harris was next, grunting from the impact. Emily and the teenager were already up, staring at the destruction. Daniel forced himself to his feet. They had survived. Barely. But the night wasn't over. The city stretched before them, dark, endless, filled with death. And the undead? They were still out there. Still hungry. Daniel looked at his exhausted, battered group. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders. The world was gone. The dead had taken everything. But as long as they were alive, they still had a chance. Come on, Daniel said. We keep moving. And so, in the night of the endless hunger, the survivors disappeared into the dark, toward whatever came next. The end.